So nice of you to clap before you know anything about whether or not I'm worth clapping for. My name's Tanner Lund. I am an incident analyst for Indeed. I am based in Tokyo, where we've recently started doing a lot more incident analysis in addition to their US-based headquarters. And I'm here to talk to you today about, well, the title says Patterns, Not Categories, Learning Across Incidents. Well, there's a lot of appetite for learning across multiple incidents, right? We have a lot of incidents, we endure them, sometimes we make post-mortem documents about them, sometimes we have a library of those and we wish we could mine that for something useful and helpful. And just so you know, by the way, the QR code there is to a handout with links and references and other things. It'll show up again, and like they mentioned, there should be PDFs of these slides that go out later, so you don't need to scramble. But that will be available as a resource to you. But SRE is a really interesting thing because it's about adapting to unusual circumstances a lot of the time. As a non-technical example of that, the last time I came to SREcon here, it must have been 2019, I showed up to the airport to get on my flight, and they looked at my passport and said, "Your passport expires within 6 months. You can't get on this plane." I said, "But I'm speaking tomorrow. What do I do?" But there happened to be an expert there who apparently had seen this before, and he said, "Here's what you do. You go straight to the Seattle, whatever off it was called. You go up to this floor. You go and you fill out this paperwork, and you ask them for an emergency passport renewal. They will say no, but just insist politely 2 times, and it will go through. And you'll need to sit there and wait until 3 p.m. till the end of their work day, and then they'll print you a new passport, and then I can get you on the 5 p.m. flight from here to Singapore, and you'll arrive 2 hours before your talk starts." And I said, "Okay, well, we'll try it." And it happened exactly as he described it would. How did he know how to do that? Because he was an expert. And expertise is what really, it supports the bedrock of the rest of the teams. That's kind of the idea of SREs being embedded in teams when you do it that way, is to have folks who are experts in certain competencies that can really lift teams up. That's the idea of SRE organizations in general, that they can specialize in this and really know how to move things around and make a difference in places that others might not have known. But how do we share that expertise, and how do we develop more to it, right? What can I learn from my experience flying to Singapore that way? Well, I learned that I should probably check when my passport expires, so that made it better for this time. But that's a minor improvement, right? That's like saying, oh, at the end of an incident or a retrospective, "Oh, well, we need a new monitor for this because we didn't catch it with monitoring, and then we need a bug fix, and then we need to update the run book." Like, I can say that about any postmortem you put in front of me without looking at it. So how do we go deeper than that? As we talk today, you might have ideas of things that are patterns, things that keep cropping up or that feel to you like there's a theme to them. Keep those in mind. If they feel appropriate, share them in the Slack thread. I would like to get that conversation going, but even if not, just be thinking about them. The point of these talks is to be helpful to you and to your organizations, and so whether or not it's the words exactly coming out of my mouth, or if it just sparks an idea and then you have to think about it for a minute, that's what matters. And the thing is, when people try and do cross-case analysis, they often go with categories. We've got this many network incidents, or this many typo-related incidents, or things like that. And they look for categories, and there's a lot of discussion about what categories work well. But categories have fundamental limitations. Right? I don't know if you've ever seen on the internet people arguing about, is a hot dog a sandwich, right? Well, that's an argument about categories. Is the ocean a soup? That's a question about categories. And we know learning across multiple incidents to try and pick up on themes or deeper investments is valuable. People have been trying it for a long time, right? Here we have, for example, Dan Liu's Git repo of postmortems. It's relatively large. I think it's a bit older now. But there have been a lot of attempts like this to gather publicly or within companies categories of groups of postmortems and put them in categories, and what can we learn from this? But the fact is that learning thematic things from this is hard. It's very challenging. Even if we go back and we look at these, look at these categories here, and this isn't to criticize Dan, but config errors, hardware power failures, conflicts, time as a category. What am I supposed to do with this information? How am I supposed to intervene in my systems or change what I do as an SRE based on seeing these different categorizations? And ultimately it comes down to, do the categories serve us, or do we serve the categories? How many of you have ever had to get into a discussion with someone about what severity an incident was? Right? That can go on for a while. Or had an argument about who the incident or the postmortem should belong to, right? Which team, right? This is a categorization question. In the case of the severity, oftentimes the conversation is actually what priority or attention or resources should we be giving the incident right now? How bad is it, and therefore am I allowed to wake people up? Is the actual conversation you want to have. But severity is our shorthand for it. So in some places, these categories serve us. They help us organizationally. But in other places, you can really get distracted arguing about whether it belongs in this bucket or that bucket, when in the end, it doesn't matter so much. Right? Categories are meant to help us think. We're not meant to be slaves to these categories. I tried to do a categorical analysis back in 2017 at Microsoft across, well, a lot of incidents. Because it was across all of the different divisions of Microsoft. And it was the high severity ones and it was the low severity ones. And we did some data analysis, and we got a data scientist involved and looked at a whole bunch of stuff, and I did a talk about it, which is what's on the screen there. And basically we found that it's really hard to do. Data cleanliness, statistical significance, being able to pull things out of context. It was just kind of hard to make heads or tails of what we were looking at. And then, of course, like, do you fill out every single postmortem record fully, completely, and accurately every single time there's an incident? No, there's gaps in data. People fill things out in different ways. There's just inconsistencies. It's tough to do this mechanically. Just recently, a couple months ago, Clint Byram from Spotify shared a talk where he did what he called incident archaeology, I think he called it. And he went and he dove into the repository of incidents and their postmortems or retrospectives at Spotify and shared a bunch of his findings. And it's really interesting. You should actually go listen to the talk. I can't summarize it well for you, but one of the main things was simply that it's really hard to do. It's hard to craft the right questions. Even when you pull in analytical experts, it is difficult to start figuring out what all of this means when you're trying to do statistics, when you're trying to bucket things and categorize things. A lot of times, because I've been trying to do this for years, I'd come up with, oh, here's this theme, here's this thing that's across a lot of incidents, and then I would tell to someone and be like, and? Right, I'd tell a team that, and then like, we've known about that issue for years. Like, this isn't news. Or they can't make heads or tails. It's like, I don't know what that means. Like, there's an unusually large number of network categorized incidents. Like, okay, are you saying that the network is fragile? Are you saying that we like to categorize things that way? Are you saying that the applications are not robust to network failures? What are we actually saying here? Or similarly, what do you want me to do about it? Right? Sometimes they don't feel actionable when we provide these kind of insights. So how can we make things that are actually insightful and that are actionable, and that the people who have the power to do anything about it can care about it and can help them? Right? Another common one is repeat incidents. Raise your hand if you've ever had an incident that felt like you just dealt with it. Right? That's a lot of hands. Similarly, raise your hand if you've ever had someone tell you that there's no such thing as a repeat incident. Fewer people, but still happens, right? That's also a categorization argument. But that's the thing, is this incident a repeat or not? Is an argument that can go on for a long time. And people feel very strongly about it. But fundamentally, it feels like there's something similar there, right? Even if someone tells you it's not a repeat, it's not identical because X, Y, and Z reason, it's a different day, the system has changed, you can't set foot in the same river twice, etc. But it feels similar. Why does it feel similar? Because people are built for pattern recognition. We know that there's something to learn from this. We know that there's things in common. Perhaps it's going to take the same mitigation as before, or we just need to call up the same people as before, or maybe it's because of the same types of traffic flows, maybe, you know, PS5 launch date, for example, or something like that. Right? And having pattern recognition without having to have a huge statistically significant body of work is something humans are very good at. Here's just a generic Grafana dashboard. Do you see what look like some patterns there? Do you see some regularities? Yeah. Do you see some things that maybe could be anomalies and could possibly warrant some further investigation if you were in charge of this dashboard? Yeah, maybe. And that's with you having no context and not knowing these systems at all. If you're an expert, you can dig in even deeper because, oh, I've seen that before. That happens every Wednesday. It's fine. Or every time it does that, even though it's still green, things start to go bad really quickly. We have to act now. That expertise, that pattern recognition over days and over months, as you get used to a system, can help teach you what's going on and predict what will happen and know what interventions to take without having to do a statistical analysis of it. And I'm not anti-statistics and I'm not anti-AI. I'm actually studying a PhD related to both of those. But we have to know their place. We have to know what they're good at, and we have to know where to work well with them. Or what about jumping into an incident? Have you ever jumped into an incident and you can just kind of feel that it's about to get worse? Yeah. Maybe a lot worse. Maybe really, really bad. Have you ever felt like, I knew we should have called someone sooner? That's pattern recognition. Even if you couldn't state explicitly what it was, you felt that there was something there, and you've learned from it. What we want to try and do, and this is the hard part, and I'm not going to have an easy answer for you in just an hour or less than an hour, if I don't talk too much, of talking to you here, is how do we take this expertise and these pattern matchings that we've been doing individually inside our heads, maybe even subconsciously, how can we make it explicit? How can we share it with others? Christopher Alexander, who was an architect from mid-century, 50, 60, 70 years ago now? I'm getting old. Developed something that's become known as pattern theory as he was trying to figure out how to architect things. He had a lot of opinions and ideas that I won't necessarily be getting into, and he is somewhat of a controversial figure, but one of the things he wanted to do is he thought it was important for buildings to be designed and built as much as possible by the people who live in them, but they're not architects. So how do we reconcile that? And some of his idea was pattern languages, patterns. He defined ideas of architecture and put them in human understandable terms so that people could try and reach for their different preferences or recognize, oh, this is a good tool for this situation, or this is good when you're in a sunny place, or this is something that's a bad idea if you're in a two-story house, right? Heuristics and rules of thumb and ideas. They all rolled up to some principles that he thought were universal. This is a list of them. They don't seem very human readable right now, but I promise each one has like a 2-sentence explanation that makes it pretty clear. Slides are not for walls of text, so I don't want to do that. But these are some of the principles that he thought things should roll up to, right? The idea being that you have universal laws, like laws of physics, and those can give expression to patterns, like we've been talking about, and those patterns have specific instantiations. Does this sound like object-oriented programming a little bit? It should. I'll get to that in a second. So the pattern concept is an abstraction. It's what is in common between these different concepts or these two different events, even though they have specific things about them that are different. He really went in and dug in and developed this further, and then it became really popular, and then tons of papers and books have been written about it, and it's been applied to so many other fields beyond architecture, right? as an example, Christopher Alexander, he wanted patterns to have a certain structure to them initially, and it was relatively rigid, and then later he decided it could be more flexible. But this is an example. He'd say you've got to have a name, you had some ranking, you have to have at least a picture, you have to explain the context, which I think is important. That's part of what's missing when you do the machine analysis, is the context of what you're looking at. Right? If a network team just got reorged, and then you've got a lot of network incidents, that means something different. Or if a team just got renamed, or if all the SREs roll up under a certain thing, right? The context helps you to understand the data you're looking at. A description of problems, a description of forces or pressures. There are incentives, right? There's the incentive to ship code on time, and there's the incentive to deploy reliable code. And those are both, in theory, good, but they can be in tension, right? Quite often they are. And many of the decisions we make as SREs and those who are developing the products themselves are trade-off decisions between speed of delivery and reliability and all of these other things. That's part of what rapid deployment and some of the DevOps ideas we're trying to do, is trying to make the two play better together so that you could deploy quickly but still reliably, things like that. Trying to reconcile those trade-offs and make them less costly than they are. But the trade-offs still remain. We've got other examples, education. So I wonder, what would that look like for site reliability? What would be a good template for that? I'm not going to assert it authoritatively for you. My intent is to start the conversation here, and then from all of us, we'll find what works. What's helpful for your teams? What's helpful for your org, or for the industry at large? Please opine everywhere. Here's an example from a particular federated wiki. It's like a wiki, but more decentralized. I won't spend all my time explaining that, but this one's about city development, basically. And so this one is called Mobility Corridor. And they've got like a one-sentence description, and they have up to 3 links to other concepts. And then there's a problem statement and a discussion. This one's talking about how you need to be able to move traffic in and out and through cities, and what's the best way to do that. If you keep it around the outside to keep the city smog and traffic free, that's great, but then people can't get anywhere. And then in the therefore section, it puts forth what they suggest as a pattern. It's like, this is a rule of thumb or a heuristic that could be helpful. And then there's lots of links as well. You can go follow up on that later. Also, again, in the handout, which you can get to through the QR codes that will be popping up sporadically and will be on the PDF. Well, that's one idea of patterns that can be put together in a repository that becomes a pattern language for that field. A set of solutions or a set of common problems that you identify. It is not, however, a run book. It's not a, if you see this, then do that every time. It's not best practices either. What is best? Best is going to depend on your context and on your situation and on the skill sets you have available to you. We heard earlier today from the Sony folks that different structures for SRE teams have different trade-offs to them. And depending on the products you work with, the engineering teams you have, the skills and experience, the expectations, different setups may be appropriate. And so that's one of the things with patterns too, is you can have a lot of patterns, and then some of the patterns might kind of conflict. That's fine. You pick the one that's better suited to your situation. Patterns in software. Has anyone seen this book before? And heard of this book before? Right? Design patterns. So this is not the first time that anyone in software has talked about Christopher Alexander's work. It very much was influential on the folks who came up with the ideas of object-oriented programming, and even in patterns for design of software. Makes sense. Designing architecture, designing software. You can have patterns for both. But this book is kind of old. I'm not saying it's outdated. It's not. But it's targeted on the writing of software. What about design patterns at the level that SREs work at? Systems, APIs, monoliths, microservices, vendors. Are there patterns for that? Could we develop those? Part of it is that you are part of the system. When we talk about our systems, when I ever speak about a system, I'm not just talking about the software that runs, I'm talking about the team that owns it. Realistically, how long do any of your software systems run without a human touching them in some way? Not very long. I'm not saying they couldn't, but they're not. There's always new things being deployed. There's always different varying loads being put on them by customers. There's patches and fixes. There's new integrations. And especially when there's incidents, when there's bugs, you are there to intervene in addition to your automation, of course, and make things better again. Hopefully make things even better than they were before. Therefore, you are a part of the system. That can feel messy to model because it's not a mathematical function. People are a little bit more unpredictable. If you've got your flow chart of like, oh, well then the alert fires and then the automation does the thing and then it's better. Or it's not quite the same as the alert fires and hopefully the guy wakes up because it's at 3 in the morning. Probably will, but maybe not. You know, there's some variation there, but also the variation is we'll wake up this person and they're relatively new to the team, so they probably will need to ask for help, but nope. Turns out they know exactly what to do because they've seen this before. So when you think of a system, include the people in it because it's a social technical system. Social, people, technical. Ward Cunningham is someone who was very influenced by pattern theory in the past, but now as well. And pattern theory influenced a lot of the things that he had a lot of influence on, like the concept of a wiki, which he's now extended to federated wikis. The idea of technical debt, extreme programming, and design patterns, which includes that design patterns book, but just more generally the concept of design patterns for software. Why did I pick Ward Cunningham and not necessarily any of the other people who were influenced? Just because I like Ward. There are plenty of others. One pattern, possibly, one idea at least, would be the idea of federated decisions, local expertise, trying to push the decision-making for a system as close to the people who will have to deal with that decision as you can get away with. Right? When decisions come from on high, sometimes there's a mismatch from the way things actually work on the ground or with the actual system you have to deal with, right? And that's normal. It's because there's a gap. It's not because the folks on high don't know what they're doing. It's because they're not in the system every day like you are. So federated decisions is an idea. Try and have the sharp-end practitioners, the people who push code, the people who are responding to incidents, make decisions, be the ones making decisions as much as possible, is a potential pattern. Involve the customer in design. This is one that is very big in, I think, extreme programming and other similar things like Agile, more broadly. Involve the customer in the design because they more clearly see the costs and the trade-offs. Many times, and I'm very guilty of this myself, especially because I love studying incidents, SREs come forth with, we need to be more reliable in X, Y, and Z. And then there's pushback from other parts of the business that say, well, we need to ship the new product or we're going to go out of business, right? If you spend all of your resources on reliability, you're not spending them elsewhere, and so there's a trade-off. Involving the customer helps you to try and find that balance a little bit more. Pair programming, another potential idea, right? You've got two sets of eyes. You can talk about things together. There's benefits to that. Are there cons? Absolutely, especially if you can't stand the person that you're paired up with, or you work remotely or async, and it's not so easy to do. But these are some concepts here. And you notice all of these are it depends sorts of things. You really get in trouble when you try and set an exact set of best practices that's just a rigid iron law that does not adapt to your situation. I like using Kanban, for example, to manage certain things with certain teams. But there's certain products and teams that it just isn't appropriate for. And more broadly, right, trying to run things with boards and with tickets and sprints, for example, when you have a lot of interrupt-driven work, that can start to get difficult to manage at the same time. So all of these patterns have value, but they have to be considered into where they're appropriate in terms of patterns of things that you can do and patterns of things that happen to you. Where does this start to come in a little bit more specifically to what we deal with every day? So there's been some folks, Dr. Dave Woods, Dr. Richard Cook, and some others who've been kind of importing some ideas about adaptability and resilience into the software world. There they are being interviewed. They've done a lot of good work. One of the first things they did is they gathered a whole bunch of people from a whole bunch of different software companies, and they stuck them all together in New York, and then they were snowed in by a blizzard, and they sat in and they talked about different postmortems, different incidents, different events, and what were the themes they could find out of them. Now, I'm sure you're curious what they are. I'm not going to tell you. Go read the report. But they found some patterns of things that kept happening to systems, that kept happening to teams, by talking across many groups. And Dave Woods in particular, he gave me and a lot of other folks some homework about how to try and help our own teams and ourselves and others to get something out of this. I know we've been a little bit abstract here. I'm going to try and get into the more practical application here. But each pattern, I'm going to read the quote, each pattern describes a problem which occurs over and over again in our environment, and then describes the core of the solution to that problem in such a way that you can use the solution 1,000,000 times over without ever doing it the same way twice. Right? So that's a pretty good characterization of that pattern. Right? They're not identical implementations, but the core idea is the same. Right? The concepts recur even if the specific instantiations are different. They are a way to generalize findings, right? And that's what we wanted to do. We've got all these incidents. How can we generalize our learnings from them? Well, first is you've got to learn how to learn about patterns. Then you can identify patterns and share them with each other. And part of this is that patterns are a way of seeing things across multiple events that we can't see from one. This picture, for example, is an optical illusion. The idea is that the square marked A and the square marked B are actually the same color. In one sense, it is, because the actual pixel color values are the same. But because of the way the image is composed, we're able to have this shadow effect, add something new that wasn't there in the individual components. Maybe a little abstract, but the idea is that things can emerge. You can see things that when you're looking point by point you don't see, but when you step back, there's a broader idea. So what are some patterns of how systems adapt? I'm putting forth hypotheses here, not things by fiat. Right? And again, the idea here is that maybe there's laws, like fundamental things that happen, and then you've got patterns, and then local expressions of those patterns. And here's one, working at cross purposes. Parts of your system that are fighting each other and are getting each other's way from achieving their goals. That would be a law. A general pattern from that law would be fragmentation across unit boundaries. That's what the different ways of structuring SRE is about, is the way things are fragmented provides different benefits, but also different challenges as far as I need help with this system, but the expert on this system is asleep right now. I have to wake them up or guess whether or not it's urgent enough to do so, and if not, then wait until the morning for them, for example. Or simply just being in different teams, not knowing. In your own team, you might know who's an expert in X, Y, and Z, but in another team, you're less familiar with it because you don't interact with them as often. And so the types of expertise that you're aware of, your network, your social network of who to call, is different based on your team structure. Fragmentation across unit boundaries is a general pattern. Another example is the multi-party problem. So has anyone had an incident where they needed to have a vendor or a third party help them resolve the incident? All right? Quite common. And this is the thing, is that's getting more common as we go. More and more often, reaching out to SaaS or having specific hardware in your data centers that's more black box. Right? This is something that's happening more and more often. So this is a kind of pattern that is important to try and understand on a industry trend level. Right? This is part of working at cross purposes, right? Because, and I'll give a specific example in a minute, but you might have a database team, the database has a problem, they contact the vendor. The vendor really wants to figure out what the bug is because they're like, this is weird, we've never seen this before. This never happens to any of our other clients. But the database team just wants the mitigation. They just want their apps back up. They want the customers happy, right? So there's a slight misalignment of incentive, perhaps. I'm not saying it always happens, but it can, right? Because the vendor wants their products to be good for everybody. And the database team wants this specific problem over right now. The multi-party problem encompasses a lot of these sort of ideas. And it's not just for people paid by a different company and who don't have access to your Slack channels or your monitoring data, or you don't have access to the internals of the system they've given you. Within companies, you have the same situation, product teams and platform teams. Maybe there's a little bit more transparency because you're all on the same email domain, but the same issues can happen where you have an issue and you reach out to the Kubernetes team and you have these same sorts of back and forths and tensions and trade-offs. There's a talk that goes over this in detail and goes into some specific examples from Indeed, my employer, that Alex Ellman and Sarah Butt gave, Sarah Butt from Salesforce. So go ahead and look that up, but that's also linked. Clumsy automation is a pattern. This is a pattern that actually shows up a lot in media, and I was gonna put in a bunch of clips and stuff from movies, but then I thought, maybe that's not such a good idea. But here's some examples, right? There's the Sorcerer's Apprentice, which I've mentioned in talks before, that Mickey Mouse story, and he goes and he makes the broom that will carry the water for him, and then it just keeps filling up the well, even though he wanted it to stop, and then he tries to chop the broom in pieces, and it becomes a whole bunch of brooms that do that. Pretty much every episode of the kids' cartoon show Jimmy Neutron is about him inventing something and then it not quite working the way he wanted to, running away as automation. Or this classic tweet, to err is human, to propagate error to all server in an automated way is DevOps. Right? That's automation that's running awry. It's a theme, it's a pattern. It's something that happens a lot. Your specific expressions that you see in your companies will be different, but the pattern is there. When you have automation, it can be clumsy. In fact, it often is clumsy. It does what you tell it to. It doesn't do what you don't tell it to. But this has been in folks' consciousness for a long time. It's in very old plays like Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, cleaning robots that clean the wrong things, or they just keep cleaning forever, and vacuuming up your nice dress, for example. I have more examples in the talk I gave here, 2019, when I was very jet lagged, that you can look up that talks about that more. Here's another pattern, workarounds. This is a real thing. You could see it as a challenge, or you could see it as a fact of life and an important and valuable one. All the time, SREs and developers go around the established rules to get work done. Right? What would the higher law here be? Well, without setting it in stone, maybe it's something like you can't fully specify a dynamic living system in a short static document someone can follow, something like that. But that's really wordy. But the idea with the pattern is that there's workarounds. When you go and you do an analysis of an incident that happened, you can look for workarounds, and you should. But don't look for them with the intent to shut them down. Look for the workarounds to learn from them. Say, okay, well, why do they feel the need to work around this? Why do they not follow this normal build process? Oh, it's because it takes too long. Oh, it's because no one on my team actually has the permissions to do X, Y, and Z. Oh, it's because it's tied in with the other system that's broken right now. And then that can lead you to deeper insights. In general, whenever you see a strange pattern or a behavior that you don't understand, don't immediately assume that they're in the wrong. Ask yourself, why did it make sense for them to do that? Assume that they wanted to do a good job, that they like being employed, and that they were trying to get things back up, and ask, why did this make sense to them in the moment? And you can dig into these patterns. So there's in theory, there's two pieces to this. There's pattern priming. You learn what some patterns are. Maybe you just take the ones that I've asserted are patterns. Maybe you agree with me or not. I don't know. I didn't come up with them either. But pattern priming is you're going through your daily life or you're going through your work and you start recognizing examples of the patterns. Start noticing, start writing them down. Whenever there's something that you feel is a pattern, track it. And the opposite is pattern finding. And this is the harder work. And this is more where we have to start. Before you can prime, you have to find is, there's something in common between these 5 incidents. What is it? They're all very similar. And sit there and think about it. And you might find in a specific instantiation, like, oh, okay, these all have to do with DNS. Like, okay, but what about DNS is it that's similar? How can we generalize this? What's the real concept here? It's like, oh, we lack expertise on these teams to deal with DNS, which is the foundation of our entire stack here. So it's a question of expertise, as an example. And if ever you're having trouble, if the concept just hasn't quite clicked yet, some of the general concept is just, you can think of like a family home as a pattern. It's a generic pattern with infinite variations. No 2 homes are exactly the same, not even in the most suburban of suburbia. Even if all the houses looked exactly the same on the outside, they've got variations on the inside. So what are your SRE examples? This is the homework that I'm giving you, and this is what I'm trying to encourage you to do. It doesn't make sense for me to just tell you what all the patterns are, because who am I? How am I going to know what those are? You are the ones who are experts in your systems. You know how it works. All I am is some nerdy guy who's studied these ideas and wants to help spread them around. Here's another idea. The people affected should be involved in the design process. Don't throw work on a backlog unilaterally. This sounds similar to the include customers thing, but think about it in terms of action items after an incident happens. An incident happens, and maybe you do a retrospective on it, and then maybe a bunch of action items are cut, right? And they're asserted. We have to do these things. Maybe it's just a bullet list, or maybe they all end up as JIRA tickets or something else. But you have a backlog of stuff to do that's prioritized, and having this list of action items that kind of floats outside of it, how do you reconcile the two? What's going to give so that you have time to do that? And especially if you're going to try and throw work over the fence to another team, it's like, well, they upstream broke us, so here's an action item for you. Talk to them, maybe, because all of this is going to have to be a negotiation and a trade-off. And unfortunately, hopefully not, but unfortunately, sometimes the answer is, this is just a risk we have to accept. Like, we're not going to be able to fix X, Y, and Z, so we're just going to have to work around it, be willing to adapt. Maybe you downstream can be more robust to it, or it just is what it is. Not what we want to hear. We would like to be resilient and robust to everything all the time, but everything's a trade-off. This can go really deep. I'm not going to explain this graph exactly. I'm just going to put it up here so you can think about it. In various fields, things get really, really formalized. For example, there's a professor in Tokyo, or near Tokyo, Takeshi Iba, who likes to go and sit down with experts in different fields and they build pattern languages of them. And those pattern languages get printed in books. And then he creates little flashcards of them. And so you can have flashcards of stack of like collaborative learning, or structuring classrooms, or giving a presentation. Should I have used those ones? Maybe. But this can go quite deep. So all of this is, again, a trade-off. Just like with everything else we've talked about, the amount of time and effort you have to looking for patterns and themes is limited. So what we should do is we should leverage the expertise that's already there, right? There are folks on your teams, and maybe it's you, that already know some things that are a worrying risk, or know some things that work really well for you. I mean, like experts tend to know both of those things. They have horror stories of things that, dirty laundry, like the same password's been used on 20 different databases and really shouldn't be, as one cartoonish example. But on the other hand, they might also know, oh yeah, I've got just like a notepad doc full of really good Perl scripts, and then they're really good for this, that, and the other. What can you share around? Fundamentally, this is about getting folks to talk to each other and to share their expertise and to continually update their understanding of how their systems actually work. Because the system and what you think the system is are never exactly the same. You've built a model in your head. No one's going to have a full model of the whole system. They're too complex these days. Even if they did, they go out of date. So these activities, studying incidents, looking for patterns, being thoughtful in what you build, talking to experts, are just opportunities to update your understanding of how the system actually works. To challenge and say, oh, this is how I thought it works. This is how it actually works. And anytime you feel that surprise, I suggest you write it down. That is information in and of itself. When you learn that something works differently than you thought it did. That could be in a bad way, that can be in a good way. But fundamentally, it comes down to this. Do the categories or the themes or the patterns have predictive power? Do they help you in some way? Do they serve you and help you decide, or take to management and say and make an argument for, hey, we really need to figure out something about the edge, because we've got several different teams and they all own a piece of the edge, but we have these fundamental problems that none of our teams individually can solve. We need to do something cross-team, and this is the pattern, and here are the receipts from incidents that support that pattern, to make an argument, and then the leadership can make whatever decision they're going to make. They still need to manage the trade-offs of like, well, do we have the time and resources for this? What will this cost us? But you're able to have that conversation now, and you can speak in their language, and they can speak in yours, and you can talk about things, just like with the optical illusion, showing something that wouldn't have been seen by just looking at 2 pixels. It's the whole composition that gives you the optical illusion. Looking across the multiple incidents, you're able to paint a new picture of something that wouldn't be seen otherwise, and help your leaders to see those so that they can invest in them. Right? The things that can be dealt with by your individual teams, you're already working really hard to deal with them. And you're good at it. Where you need help is when you've got to go across teams. Now, yes, certainly there's a lot of guerrilla work that can be done where you just do it and don't tell anybody. But it sure helps to have management support, doesn't it? So, share your expertise. Pull things out of your experts' heads and share them around to help others. Maybe that is pair programming. Maybe that is riding shotgun with someone. It's like, hey, I'm going to do a complex deployment. How about you join the call and watch me do it? How about next time you do it and I'll watch you? Part of the trick with this, by example, is there's something called the law of fluency. And there's this idea that experts, even if they try and tell you step by step what they do, they're not going to say all of the things they do. Not on purpose. They just don't always realize that you don't know how to do something. And they're like, oh, well, I don't need to explain that part, so they already know. Or they don't even realize that they're doing it themselves. Like they've got some hotkey they use all the time. They're like, hey, what are you doing? I have no, what is it? What button is that? So watching someone work is even more valuable than asking someone to explain how they work. But whatever you do, share your expertise. Part of pattern finding is about patterns of knowledge, patterns of things that have come across. And fundamentally, it's going to come from pulling out that expertise. I know I keep saying that over and over again, but so much of trying to learn across incidents has been from a shallow, no context, mathematical basis. And while it can help, it often is unsatisfying. You have folks who already know. Share it around. Here's a handout, information again. There's a survey in there. Eventually, my evil plan is to try and set up a public repository somewhere where there can be a whole bunch of patterns that lots of people contribute to. But I'm not ready to do that yet because I haven't decided how I want it to be structured. And I am not the czar of patterns, and I wouldn't want to be the bottleneck for that. It's not my community. But for now, if you have ideas for patterns, anything that's come into your mind, stuff that maybe you've put in the Slack, and please chat in the Slack if you like, or just other ideas in general, go to the survey, drop them in there. Hopefully I've set it up so that it's multiple submission, doesn't require your email, anything like that. You can just drop in whatever you think, and then we can talk about this. But fundamentally, it's what have you noticed? What have your experts noticed? What keeps happening? What was useful? What's a risk that you've got gnawing at the back of your mind, but you haven't been able to put into words yet? These are things that you're sure are happening, or also just weak signals where you're like, I feel like there's something there, but I'm not sure yet, and it requires more investigation. But fundamentally, it's this. I don't know whether this was very surprising or informative to you, but I hope so. And in the end, I hope that you're able to understand on a deeper level how your systems work, how your experts work, and how to learn more about learning. This has been Patterns, Not Categories, and I'm Tanner Lund.